absolutely alien craft. There's no question about it.
Why?
Well, first of all, the scope of the project was to back engineer it. If they were United States craft, we wouldn't be going backward trying to find out how they were built if we had built them. They've done several test flights in it, not out of the atmosphere. These are short, controlled, low-altitude flights. Essentially, they have a prized possession here, so they're not going to risk taking this to a point where they could potentially lose it as, at the gravitational pull of the Earth or going too high. But I witnessed several tests outside the compound and also one, probably about 100 feet away. The time where I entered the hangar, I witnessed recovered alien spacecraft that the Department of Naval Intelligence in the United States was back engineering.
Lake, which is in the northeast corner of the Nevada test site, is a place called Papoose Lake. It's a dry lake. There's a secret area there called S4, and I believe that that's where they test the saucers out of. My sources are varied, but the primary source being Bob Lazar, who worked on one of the 9 saucers that were stored there. In the summer of 1988, I was having this house appraised, and the appraiser brought along, the appraiser was interested in UFOs, and he brought along a friend of his who was a scientist, former scientist at Los Alamos. The appraiser, being interested in UFOs, wanted the opinion of this scientist on UFOs. So I met this gentleman, Bob Lazar, and he didn't believe it at all. He told me that he worked at Los Alamos on SDI. He had a Q clearance. He had a number of other compartmentalized clearances. He knew a lot of secret things. He said that if there had been something like this, some cover-up, that he would have known about it. So having the specialized, highly educated person that he held 2 degrees, master's degrees from MIT, and also knowing Dr. Teller, who was the father of the H-bomb, he was able to send his resume to Dr. Teller, who then called him and asked him where he wanted to work. Dr. Teller proposed 2 places, either EG&G in Las Vegas or Lawrence Livermore Laboratories in California. Bob said, I want to work at Area 51. He didn't tell Dr. Teller the reason, but he wanted to get as close as he could to where we thought the saucer testing was going on. Well, during the next 6 weeks after that, he was contacted by EG&G. He was given 3 security interviews and 3 interviews on his basic knowledge. They were so impressed that apparently they went ahead and hired him. The first thing that I knew is on December 6, 1988, Bob came up here as he usually did in the evening. I was sitting here writing checks, and he sat right in that seat. And I said, what's going on, Bob? And he said, I saw a disc today. And I said, I was so startled, I thought I didn't hear him right. I said, what? And he said, I saw a disc today. And I said, theirs or ours? And he said, theirs. And I said, you went to the test site? He said, yeah, I just got back. This is the first time I went up there. I said, oh, my God. I said, well, what are you doing here? I said, don't jeopardize your security clearance. Work up there for a while and find out what's going on. He said, no. He said, you've taken so much flack over this thing, people not believing you. I'm going to tell you exactly what I saw.
Bob knew when and where flight tests of these objects were going to take place because 3 weeks in a row, he took people up there and they videotaped it. How did he know?
Did bring some friends on a specific day where I wouldn't be working, and they got to view some of the tests for themselves.
It's just sitting there.
Lazar claims they saw a brilliant light, an alien spacecraft that was moving through the sky in directions and angles beyond the performance of conventional aircraft.
Look at that. Is that beautiful? Is it beautiful?
Now, we weren't in the base. We were still 10 miles away from it. But even out at that far, there was still a reasonable amount of security. And we were able to see quite a few things. Well, I had met Ed Teller at Los Alamos one day. We had a brief meeting and a talk. Shortly thereafter, moved to Las Vegas and basically left the scientific community to do other work. Sometime later, I decided to re-enter and send applications out to several other national labs, and also one to Ed Teller. And he gave me a call, and he said he might have something that I'd be interested in. and suggested that I go for an interview. Shortly thereafter, someone from EG&G called and told me to come down for an interview there. They made it very clear that EG&G had nothing to do with it. They were just using the building as a place to do the interview. After a short time, they said I was basically overqualified for the position, but they may have something else in the future. Shortly thereafter, they asked me to come down for another interview, but they led me to believe it was a field propulsion system, and of course I thought it was something that, in secret, that we were working on. Later, only did I find out that it was a back engineering program dealing with alien craft. I flew out of Las Vegas McCarran Airport, and I flew to Groom Lake in a 737 aircraft. We land at Groom Lake, and there's a bus there that drives about 15 miles south, approximately. I'm really not sure exactly how far, down to a smaller dry lake bed known as Papoose Lake. And right up against the side of the mountain is the S4 installation. It was very military-like. It was certainly not a scientific atmosphere. Very high security. Everywhere you walked, you had to have an escort, an armed escort, even into the bathroom. All doors lock and open with your badge, and it was a very oppressive atmosphere. I believe I was only there 2 or 3 days, probably 2 days before I saw the craft. I should step back a minute and say that when I first saw the craft the first time, it was walking into the hangar, and my impression was, well, this explains all the UFO sightings. This is just a secret military aircraft we're working on, and that's the end of that. It was actually the second time when I saw the craft, when I got to enter it and look over it, and I finally realized what was going on, that this is an alien craft. And of course this was after I read the briefings, and that was a totally different feeling. That was not a feeling of excitement. It was almost an ominous feeling, that feeling as if you shouldn't even be there. It's very difficult to describe. A very sleek, thin-looking, flying saucer-shaped craft. There were 9 total. I only got to essentially work, back engineer, or analyze one of the craft. But there was a separate hangar for each of the crafts, and each one was essentially different in its visual appearance. It's very plain. It's all one solid color, a grayish pewter color, the same color as the outside of the craft. There are no sharp corners anywhere. Every device in the craft, the seat, the amplifier housings, everything has a rounded corner on it, almost as if it was all fashioned out of wax and then slightly melted, so everything curved, even where the ceiling meets the floor on the end. Everything has a curve to it. A very impractical use of space. And there are 3 levels. The lower level houses the amplifiers themselves that swing, the 3 of them. The center level is where you enter the craft, where the seats and the amplifiers are, and the top level is a small area, and I did not have access to that, so I don't know what's up there. The equipment inside, the size of the seats, the materials that were in use, completely alien to us, pardon the pun, and the fuel, element 115, essentially non-existent. All these factors together, and of course the briefing information stating that they were alien craft. Well, that was part of my job, was to back engineer that and find out exactly how that operated. And they had made some progress, but I really don't know how long the craft was there being analyzed, if it was 1 year or 10 years before I got there, but it seems like only a modest amount of progress had been made. The propulsion system is really an amazing setup. There's 2 parts: there's gravity amplifiers and the reactor that provides the power. The reactor itself is a total annihilation reactor fueled by antimatter. It uses a super heavy element, element 115, as it would appear on the periodic chart. None has yet been synthesized on Earth. It's my opinion that this occurs naturally in certain star systems. This element is bombarded in an extremely small accelerator. The element under bombardment, undergoes spontaneous fission and produces antimatter particles. This tremendous amount of power the system generates operates the amplifiers, and also as a byproduct of the 115 undergoing this bombardment, it produces the interesting phenomena, a gravity A wave, as it's known to be called, almost the same way microwaves travel, essentially applied to the gravity amplifiers, and by means of the electric current also provided by the reactor, it's amplified and focused. The amplified signal is shifted slightly out of phase, and by virtue of that they can repel or attract a gravitational body. The craft can take off on one gravity amplifier. There are 3 in this particular craft. When it's using just one amplifier, essentially pushing away from the Earth, it's known as Omicron configuration. For space travel, the craft will rotate up on its side, face the 3 gravity amplifiers at the target. They'll focus down on a single point some tremendous distance away, and the amplifier and the associated and the reactor, the associated reactor, will be run up to full power, and they essentially pull the fabric of space, distort space and time toward the craft, so they can traverse a tremendous amount of distance in virtually no time at all, essentially bending space, since the fabric of space essentially and gravity and time are all interlaced. When you start distorting gravity, you distort time and space along with it. And these aren't theories. We've known these for a while. We just have no way of controlling them. But apparently the civilization has found out how. Lifted off, it made a slight hissing sound, a slight blue glow from the bottom, probably due to the extreme voltage that's present on the craft. Just gently glided and later sat down. It was very uneventful, but almost totally silent. There were an extensive amount, 120 some odd briefing documents, all of them very short, and essentially what they were doing was just giving me an overview of the other aspects of the research being done on the craft, and the bulk of the information, all the technical information, was specifically dealing with the power and propulsion system, which is what I was supposed to be working on. But there were documents basically stating that these were aliens that possessed the craft. There were some autopsy reports that, not very in-depth, they had no reason to give me in-depth reports on that, but they did have pictures, and 2 pictures actually, of the alien carcass with the chest cut open and a single organ removed, and the organ itself was sectioned. It seemed to, from my non-medical viewpoint, it seemed that this one organ performed many functions instead of one. There were documents on metallurgical work being done on the craft, and really every aspect that separate groups were working on. And I'm sure they got a briefing on what my group was working on, a very abbreviated one, as I did on theirs. Yeah, it did mention the Zeta Reticuli system, and how that information was extracted from the craft, I don't know. Maybe there were star charts or something along those lines. There was mention of alien intervention in the past. I mean, extremely long ago. Something along the lines of millions of years ago. From the information that I looked at, it seemed that, and there again, these are briefing documents, so I can't myself ascertain whether or not these are true. I can only assume it because the briefing documents I read that pertain to the propulsion system were true, because I dealt with that. But they did make reference to contact with the Earth over 10,000 years ago, also with genetic alterations that ended in a simian being, and all kinds of claims. Mentioned several times that I'd walk through an area and looked in a small window and saw something small there, but I really can't say that was an alien body. A lot of people jump on that and say, yeah, you must have seen an alien, but there's just as much chance that they were trying to figure out the size difference and how the seats fit a body, and they had made up a small mannequin or something. I didn't see anything moving around alive. So I always say no, I have never seen a living alien. That's, again, a complex question. It's not just one reason. There's several, many things. Harassment, to protect myself, the fact that this information being contained is also unfair, but there are many, many reasons. Yes, I was shot at while getting on the freeway here in Las Vegas. Friends were harassed and taken out of work that knew me. Many things happened.
On March 21st, 1989, he asked me if I wanted to view one of the test flights. This was on a Tuesday, and I said, well, sure, but how are we going to see one? And he said, there's going to be a test flight tomorrow night just at sunset. And I know a place where we can sneak in, still be on public land, and watch it. I said, why at sunset? And he said, well, statistically, up in that area, there's the least traffic around then. So I drove with Bob and the real estate appraiser, Gene Huff, and myself, and we drove up there, got there just a little bit before sunset. We took a video camera, got out of the car, and within maybe 10 or 15 minutes, this disc comes up from behind the mountains and starts doing all these fantastic maneuvers.
The day after I was caught, I was supposed to show up for work. However, they had me debriefed at an Air Force base north of Las Vegas. That's where a lot of the friction began between myself and the people. They threatened my life. At the time, they threatened my wife's life. Past employment records, places I've been, places I've worked, people I had worked with. All this information began to disappear, and I actually began to be concerned that perhaps they were going to do the same to me. I thought it became necessary to see one of the people on a local news station, because I thought if it went on the news, they couldn't make me completely disappear. It would look very suspicious if all of a sudden this person, released these claims and then he disappeared himself. So it was kind of an insurance policy for me. Well, there's several, actually 9 flying saucers, flying discs, that are out there of extraterrestrial origin.
He was upset about the security at the base. It was an oppressive place to work. He was upset that they didn't have better scientists and a more open kind of research that would allow them to finally get to the bottom of how this alien technology worked. He thought that information should be shared with the entire world in order to benefit the entire world. Once he got caught, he was worried about his safety. They put guns to his head. They told him he was in a heck of a lot of trouble. And I think the reason he was willing to talk to me, at least what he told me in the beginning, was he was trying to save his hide. He figured by going public that they wouldn't dare do something to him. It seems to me that for several months there, after he was talking to me, there were serious attempts to intimidate him, to keep him quiet, but he had the courage to pursue it. And I think he made the right decision, because I'm not sure that he would be alive today if he had not spoken to the television camera. Michael, I was in Las Vegas television for 10 years. I worked stories about political corruption, organized crime, illegal drugs. I've never done a story anything like this. When I first met Bob Lazar, I was only tangentially interested in the UFO material. I had done some talk shows about it. I knew the public was interested in it, but I didn't know if I was going to be able to do the story about Area 51. Stories about Area 51 and possible alien technology there had been floating around for as long as I had lived in Las Vegas, but there had never been any thorough investigation, primarily because no one who had inside knowledge of the program had ever been willing to talk about it publicly until Bob Lazar. When I met Bob, I had a meeting with him and my news director and asked him a lot of questions. We asked him the basics of his story. It obviously has a fantastic story, but we decided to go forward with it because Bob himself seemed so credible. Trying to verify Bob's background proved extremely difficult. It is still proving extremely difficult. For example, we quickly found out that the schools that he said he went to had no records that he was ever there. His former employers, where he said he worked, had no record that he'd ever been there. In particular, Los Alamos National Lab was the linchpin of his credibility. We thought if we could prove that he worked at Los Alamos, as he said, it must have meant that he went to school somewhere, because they don't just hire people off the street. And if he worked at Los Alamos National Lab on classified material, it made sense that he could have been hired to work at other classified programs, such as S4, Papoose Lake. However, the people at Los Alamos lab said they had no records that he'd ever been there. They stalled on our requests for information. They wouldn't return phone calls. They wouldn't answer letters. It was as if they didn't want us to have the answers. Well, eventually we came up with a lot of indications that Bob did work there. We found, for example, the newspaper from Los Alamos that lists him as being a physicist from the lab. We found the laboratory telephone book that lists him as being an employee at the lab. We have talked to other people at the lab who worked with him, who tell us that Bob did work on classified projects, that he was a physicist, that he was there. Just this week, almost 4 years after we first started making our inquiries at Los Alamos, we finally got someone from the lab to say, yes, Bob Lazar was here. Yes, he worked at the Mason facility. Yes, that facility did some classified work. It's taken a long time, but now we know that Bob was there. We know he had a security clearance, but we still know that there are a lot of the records that we're searching have not been produced for us. We don't know why.
After you interviewed Lazar on TV, did you come in contact with other witnesses from Area 51?
Several witnesses, more than a dozen now in total, have come forward with bits and pieces of information that confirm at least parts of what Bob said. The problem is that none of them have been willing to talk publicly. They will give me bits and pieces of information privately, but I'm restricted from using their names. And there's some very good reasons for that. There's been an obvious attempt to intimidate these witnesses into keeping their mouths shut. One is a former electrical engineer who worked in the television business, who moved from Las Vegas and whom I worked with, moved to another city. He had told me by phone that he had seen a disc under a tarp in a building at Groom Lake. Well, I tried to arrange to do an interview, long-distance interview, with a camera crew in the city where he lives. He agreed to do it as long as I blacked out his face. He comes out the morning after he makes the agreement to give me this interview. There's a car sitting in front of his house, two men in suits speaking into a radio. He's not giving it much of a thought, but they followed him to work. When he gets out of work, they followed him home. No interview. He was scared. There's a woman who works in the court system here in Las Vegas, in a very responsible position, who formerly worked for a major defense contractor here in Nevada. She had sat in on meetings where she said the discussion between her employer and military officials was about wreckage from Roswell, which had been taken to Area 51, alien wreckage. She had agreed to give me this information in a private meeting that we were going to have, but the day that the meeting was supposed to happen, she didn't show up, and I found out later she'd been visited by her former employers, and they had told her she's still under oath, she could be prosecuted, but what's more, her employers hinted that harm could come to this woman or her family if she talked to me. They said, we know you do a lot of traveling. We'd hate for accidents to happen to you or your family. So she will still not talk to me now 3 years later. So there are a lot of people like that who have information, who could confirm Bob Lazar's story if they had the courage to come forward. Government or elements of our government or representatives of our government seem to use intimidation and fear tactics to keep these people quiet. But Bob has always told the same story. The story that he told me on the first day that I met him about his experiences at S4 is the same story he tells today.